Welcome to today's artist talk accompanying the Glucksman's current exhibition, Data Streams, Art, Algorithms, and Artificial Intelligence. I'm Chris Clark, Senior Curator at the Glucksman, and I'm very pleased to welcome Addie Wagenknecht. Addie Wagenknecht's work explores the tension between expression and technology, seeking to blend conceptual work with forms of hacking and sculpture. Her previous exhibitions include Museums Quartier Wien, Austria, La Gaieté Lyrique Paris, France, Istanbul Modern, Whitechapel Gallery, London, and MU Eindhoven in the Netherlands. In 2016, she collaborated with Chanel and ID magazine as part of their Sixth Sense series, and in 2017, her work was acquired by the Whitney Museum of American Art. Her installation All I Know and Then Some is currently featured at the Glucksman Cork in the exhibition Data Streams, and her work has been featured in numerous books and magazines such as Time, Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, Art in America, and the New York Times. And she holds a master's degree from the Interactive Telecommunications program at New York University, and has previously held fellowships at IB Martin Technology Centre in New York, Culture Lab UK, Institute Hyperwerk for Post-Industrial Design in Basel, and the Frank Racci Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. And Addie Wagenknecht is represented by Bitforms Gallery in New York. I will be discussing a number of Addie's works today, including her installation as part of Data Streams. If you have any questions, please use the chat or Q&A function to post, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. This talk will also be uploaded to the Glucksman YouTube channel afterwards, so keep this in mind when posting your questions or comments. I have a number of questions covering the whole gamut of her works, digital surveillance, NFTs, and new media. But I want to start with the work which I get to see every day here at the Glucksman, which is All I Know and Then Some, a work from 2014, which we remade for Data Streams, and which comprises a very large wall-based painting which repeats the phrase, "I will not download things that get me in trouble," in handwriting, or painted handwriting, and gradually transforms into the final phrase, "download everything." So first off, Addie, what do you mean by things that get me in trouble?
So it was actually a passphrase for a lab at MIT. That was a lot. They were utilizing it as the login for the lab, and I thought it was a really smart way to include essentially disclaimer and a sign off in terms of like a terms and conditions while utilizing free Wi-Fi. And so I took that and then I thought about the kind of implications of essentially agreeing to something because you have no other choice, and then how you could manipulate that to create kind of another context.
And I mean, it's a work that also bears a resemblance to, punishments inflicted on wayward students. There's writing lines on the a blackboard. I always think that when I see it, but as well as kind of conceptual art pieces. And obviously John Baldessari's work, "I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art," it feels like kind of a touchstone there as well. And can you tell us a little bit about why you'd use such a kind of a tactile, like immediate mode of communication when you're really addressing ideas of digital technology and the internet?
I mean, for me, it's more about using mediums in which makes sense for what it is I'm trying to translate. And I felt for that, again, it was like this reference to the blackboard and discipline and sort of the force of being disciplined and having to find ways out of often something that becomes abusive. So I felt that it was very much the correct medium and the correct kind of way to reference that play on both the kind of emotional experience as well as kind of the playfulness of what it was I was writing. So kind of finding something, I think a lot of my work, I try to take something heavy and find sort of a humor or like a bittersweet sort of aspect to it in which people find relief. And that was one way that I kind of approached that within that question.
Do you feel the need to discipline or monitor the time you spend on the internet? I mean, this is obviously such a huge part of your practice. And even when you work across different materials or media, the internet always feels like a bit of a touchstone for your work. Is the monitoring of behavior something that you feel quite actively in your day-to-day life? As well as when you're making work, and especially given the recent lockdown situation?
Yeah, I mean, COVID has definitely accelerated that need to be online because it's, so many of my connections, my relationships, and my work and the way that I express myself is dependent on having an internet connection. So in a way, I think artists have always kind of used what's ubiquitous and what's around them as mediums. So it seems like the natural sort of evolution of contemporary practices is that we're taking these mediums of art and phones and social media and then creating, new works or reinterpretations of those.
And I mean, humor is something obviously that you mentioned as well. I mean, it's a funny artwork in some ways. The way in which we allot certain tasks or time, spent on the internet, and now this is so quickly broken down, like we kind of cave into it, which is obviously a feature that's kind of built into these things. But just to go back to humor, like, I mean, how important is that to you in not just the way you work, but how it's received? And I'm thinking here of a particular piece, like something like Saint Patron of Tinder, which was your tongue-in-cheek shrine to broken and obsolete smartphones. But that also very cleverly introduced ideas of how attached we become to these devices, how they become part of us. I mean, when you think about humor, is that a way in? Do you feel that's a way of kind of maybe softening or inducing people to have a different kind of experience or engagement with your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, humor is such a device in terms of making people kind of accessible to their own vulnerability. And when I say that, if someone yells at you, your inclination as a human or a human being is to become protective and create a shield and immediately look for ways to become defensive. Where with humor, I think it opens you much the way relationships or love or kind of positivity does. And this, like, I don't want to sound too kumbaya, but it basically makes people more open and accessible to things that they wouldn't if you're screaming or yelling it at them. It's like, okay, there's something funny about this. Like, why is this funny to me? Why am I laughing? Like, what is the sort of larger context of this? And I think for me and a lot of my peers in kind of those post-internet contemporary circle is that we're looking at humor as a medium as much as we are using and utilizing technology, and sort of that natural aspect of technology is so much like meme culture and all of the slang, and like, there's some humor I think to existing online, and that's something that just naturally integrates itself into the work.
A piece like this also seems to capture the commonplace nature of new technology. Again, this seems to come across in other projects and pieces that you've made, like how you use Roombas as these mobile sculptural devices, or again, creating a memorial to these cracked and broken cell phones. And to me, it's a little bit like making the ephemeral, detached, even abstract nature of the internet into something that's more relatable or personal. Is that something you think about in making or devising your work?
No, that's a good question. I mean, there's some definite ephemerality, but there's also the sense of it being disposable. And so much of what we're using, especially with IoT and technology, is like it's built to be replaced and updated, and there's not a way to do that yourself, right? So there's this notion of it being ephemeral, but also being temporary. Sort of like if you've ever been online and Twitter goes down or Slack goes down or whatever kind of these congregated centralized systems are that we consider to be ethereal, they're very much also permanent, yet they're vulnerable. So there's like something to me that appeals, I think, in these devices as well. Like when I was utilizing the Roombas, it was like looking at them as these devices that are supposed to optimize our lives and our spaces, but actually my friends that had them said, oh, they don't work very well, like they're too small, oh, they commit suicide, oh, they get stuck, they're kind of stupid. Like they ended up being more labor than they actually optimized. And so I was really fascinated by that, but also sort of the way we let these systems into our spaces, be it like a Siri or some kind of Amazon device, where we are essentially, letting them aggregate large amounts of data in this way that we don't see as being surveillance or, information security kind of like exploits, which I think is quite fascinating. It's like, oh, not only are we like allowing them to exploit or personalize, but we're paying them to do such. So this kind of disconnect between elective surveillance and capitalism, I think, is quite fascinating as well.
But they're objects as well that kind of, I don't want to kind of belabor a connection here, but I always think of sometimes with kind of new technology and upgrades and things like that they're kind of like solutions to problems that didn't exist before. And case in point is like, having to buy earbuds because there's no headphone jack in your new phone. It's like, so you're solving a problem that actually you caused the problem as well. And that is, again, is that kind of thing of like, you tend to detach yourself, I guess, from maybe some of the kind of the ideas there. They become so ingrained in your kind of everyday life that it's like, well, why are we using these kind of things? Like, why have we become dependent on them, or why do we accept them so readily into, like everyday things, right?
Yeah, and this notion of sort of always being on and not able, people are like, I've noticed it especially with remote work, is that we've all moved into this remote work lifestyle and kind of live work lifestyle. Work has become life, and it's so hard to be able to disconnect because you're always connected. So in a sense, it's like, oh, you're liberated, but you're also confined and caged because you can never get away from it. So there's sort of this bittersweetness. And I remember really specifically when they started having Wi-Fi on long haul flights. And I don't know how many people have traveled long haul recently in the last 5 years, overseas, but like thinking, oh crap, they put Wi-Fi on the plane now. This was like my downtime. And suddenly now I'm in the situation where I can't escape all of this accountability that I have on email and Slack and, messaging. And like, I have to get away from that. And that was always sort of, okay, I get to read, I get to watch a movie. And suddenly now I'm connected to my devices again. And it was like this moment of, Schadenfreude in the sense that it was like, what has happened? And why did they think this is a good decision?
Yeah.
And sort of just not feeling like you have permission to escape, that you're always sort of stuck to being accessible. And if you're not, it's like what people start to question is what's wrong with her, is what's going on, why is she not accessible, why is she not reachable, when 20 years ago that was a very normal thing. It was like people didn't have phones, people didn't have smartphones, we could just leave for the day and no one thought anything of it. And suddenly now it's like you're always tethered to it in the quite literal sense of the word.
I also wonder, is there a strategy there that in making works that are familiar or relatable? And it's not so far off from the way in which tech companies kind of subtly and insidiously make devices essential to your everyday life, to the point that you don't even really question the necessity. So like, I don't really need Wi-Fi on a flight, or I don't really need a Roomba. And that strategy of making technology every day, it feels kind of analogous to the ways in which tech companies work, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's probably very intentional.
The show that you're in here in Cork, Data Streams, is a show that also really talks about, and of course your work also picks up on this, is ideas of digital surveillance and data tracking. And this is an issue that comes up in several other pieces, some of which I've written about in the past. And I'm thinking here of asymmetric love, which is this amazing kind of sculptural chandelier of CCTV cameras. And particularly also your Black Hawk paint series, where you use miniature drones to create these kind of abstract canvases. There's a sense of ambiguity in these works where systems of control are remade into objects of aesthetic beauty or value. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on this this tendency in your work. I relate it to something kind of like hacking, I guess, in a way, but almost a strategy of détournement, of kind of taking this thing and then remaking it or pushing it into a different direction that often can go against the original, the ends of the maker.
Yeah, I think with the Roombas, it felt like such a low-hanging fruit in the sense that I was thinking about a lot about how do you visualize algorithms, in the sense of how do you visualize structures of surveillance, or how do you visualize computational structures within systems. And so when I saw the way that the Roombas would essentially map the room, but in a way that was invisible, in the sense that there was never this intention of actually being able to see the visualization, but I would see it through different iterations of like Roombas running over things and painting them. So like one example was dog poop. It was like it would hit dog poop and it would drag it across the room. And I thought, first of all, it's really funny, but secondly, oh, this is super fascinating. I can see that it's mapping. I can see the mapping algorithm. And then that had me thinking about, okay, so what else is being mapped? And I think, drones to some extent, I had a similar thought pattern. It was like seeing them as an extension of the arm in the sense of warfare. So people can essentially, command drones from like Florida, but be bombing Afghanistan. And I thought, this is, horrible. There's got to be a different application for this. And thinking about it as like a mechanically assisted form of painting, but also as like a kind of contemporary actionist painting, in the sense that it's like removing the artist's hand and replacing it with technology, which in a way is sort of what's happening with art as a medium, writing as a medium. Like we're no longer using pen and paper, we're constantly typing. And I think with art, it's something similar. Like more and more artists are moving at computation as kind of a medium. And so seeing that translated, I think, through multiple devices, and just again, like going back to sort of what is it that I'm trying to explain that I feel that I can't do with words, and how do I do that utilizing a medium that makes sense. And a lot of times for me, I think kind of growing up with technology, it happens to be that like technology or IoT devices or the internet is like that medium for me, and sort of finding ways then to I guess hack it. Hacking is really about appropriation, right? So it's about appropriating things that against their original intended use. And that's sort of what I come back to with all of those works, is that's like always the core theme. It's about how can I reappropriate this in a way that it serves me versus serving kind of a larger narrative or corporate structure?
I mean, even just to stay with the Black Hawk Paint series, it's a kind of fascinating paradox that you've set up here. Um, we always think of gestural abstract painting as being about immediacy, about tactility. The brush is the extension of the arm, and what you're introducing is a sort of prosthesis. I think brings a certain amount of detachment. I'm thinking here of someone like Dave Grossman, whose book on killing explores how remote technologies, like drones, are a way of kind of inculcating a sense of detachment in the person who's actually manning these things. So you don't have to have a face-to-face encounter with the enemy. You can kind of compartmentalize it and step back from it. And so this detachment plays against what we tend to think of with abstract expressionism, where it's always been about all the up close encounter.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of, but I think that abstraction also informs it to some extent. It represents within technology, so much of technology itself is obfuscated from the user or the consumer. So in a way, that's a very accurate representation of both the works, but the structure in which they're produced.
And I guess the other thing, in terms of kind of that work, and I think this also touches on a few other pieces that you've done, which I might go back to, but you draw on art historical precedents, and certainly in your piece, American Flag 1-3, you referenced Jasper Johns and the flag paintings. Certainly, there was associations here in other works with Jackson Pollock and action painting, particularly high modernist kind of tropes and masterpieces. And do you see this referentiality, this way of kind of referencing kind of an established canon of kind of modern art, of contemporary art, as a way of consolidating the value of new media art or internet related art? I'm just thinking, particularly given that new media art, net art, these things, they occupy kind of a fringe status in art history for so long. And is there something about making reference to these accepted kind of norms, these kind of accepted forms of art making that interest you, that allows you to kind of maybe engage with kind of new media technology or new media art on a more level playing field?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to that question. One is that new media has traditionally been, and I say traditionally as in like post 1980, been very much siloed as its own sort of form of art, which isn't accepted within the mainstream kind of Western canon of contemporary art, or like at least from a Western centric point of view, has not been accepted. And now, especially with sort of crypto and the NFT explosion, I think what has happened now is that we're in a situation where contemporary galleries and established galleries, emerging galleries, blue chip galleries, they're all like realizing that there's a medium that is kind of coming to play and coming to fruition that like can no longer be ignored from the perspective of, sorry, it started to rain, from the perspective of the collectors and the curator, the curators and like the institutional validation of the works.
And can I ask you about NFTs? This is a medium you've recently started working with. How have you found this experience?
I mean, the notion that art has not always been a commodity, I think, is where like I have a lot of disconnect, because obviously art is an industry and a market as much as any other sort of asset, and people thinking that that's not the case or hasn't ever been the case are sort of disillusioned or have trust funds. Like there's always a sense that artists don't need money or we don't think about money, and I think that's just a false dichotomy in general. And so that's something I keep going back to is, NFTs originally, my hesitation around them was it was never about the art. It was always about the valuation of the sale or the work. And sorry, it just started raining really hard. and now people are sort of having to come to terms with that, or like face that that's part of the value proposition, or like the value of art is that it has some kind of like commodification, both for artists and collectors and everyone else. So like, how do you come to terms with that? Sorry, it's pouring down rain.
Have you got a canopy?
I'm under a canopy and a heater, and they've just like extended it because it started pouring. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm back.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, so what the pandemic series that you've been working on, which is, and actually you mentioned in our initial, when we first signed on, that, you know, you're in Paris and you're talking with a colleague and a friend of yours who works with NFTs. So, I mean, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that particular series, that particular project.
So when we, it's hailing. Oh my God. Okay, it's really hailing, sorry. This is a first for me. So with Pandemic Diaries, it was funny because Ayala and I had worked together quite extensively. Like we started with the Still Life series and we kind of did iterations of that. And we wanted to continue to work together because of the constraints around borders and the constraints around accessibility of each other, even though it's just an hour flight. It's a hurricane. We were not able to meet each other in person. So at some point we thought, you know, we want to be making work. We're stuck at home. Like this is a really important time and place in history. And like, how do we address this? And then how do we work within the constraints of what we're being handled, you know, essentially, which was like, we've always collaborated in person and suddenly now we have to collaborate apart. So I don't remember who came up with the idea, but we were like, okay, let's try to do this remotely. Like, let's make up some storyboards. Let's try to like, you know, conceptualize these works and then create them from a distance with each other and see how that turns out and see if it's possible to like work at such an intimate level creatively from such a far distance. And I think in retrospect, it only is so successful because we're so close. Like we're such good friends and we work so, you know, we're very similar and we know so much about each other and we have similar tastes. I think that that's what made it successful. I'm not sure there's other people I've worked with from a distance collaboratively that it was not so much of like a happy marriage. It was more like a nasty divorce. And so in that regard, I was really happy with the works, but I also think that they, in a way, kind of mark the time and space in which not only we as a society were, but we personally were, and kind of dealing with this sense of loss and mourning, but trying to reference hope or reference coping devices or, you know, things that we were using at that time to essentially ensure that we would be okay. And like, you know, how do you self-comfort yourself in a time when you're essentially not able to be with people that you depend on for that comfort? So like trying to extrapolate, I think, that into a body of work was sort of where we started with that. And then it's a sense evolved into sort of more playfulness around creative cultures and like referencing GeoCities. So we have a series on Foundations, which is an NFT site, looking at sort of referencing like this GeoCities early web aesthetic, but also the playfulness of sort of the still life and what we've always been working on, you know, for the last almost 10 years now. And trying to find like, again, how do we interpret those works into like what is contemporary and what is happening now, and referencing that in the sense and the place of an NFT felt like the natural sort of evolution of our practice for that in this time. So.
And I mean, it's a question of what the NFT can do, I guess, you know, aside from being an instrument for sharing or selling or these things. It actually reminds me of, and I have a tendency to relate these things to art historical precedents, but it's like those Lawrence Weiner or Dan Flavin statements almost in a way, these kind of certificates of authenticity, where you can remake the work or you can do this with it, but there's an agreement there and a certificate, like a quasi-legal document, which becomes fetishized as inheritor of aesthetic or historical value. What do you think about those kind of parallels with NFTs, where the procedure becomes an essential part of the work?
I mean, I think I'm in general really obsessed with the idea of proof of ownership and the kind of concept of authenticity across the board. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time kind of looking at is, especially within the culture of bootlegs, or like it's called fantasy wear, is just the notion of like, well, what's real and what's fake if you can't delineate the difference? And what does that mean in you know, especially within art, and the idea that NFTs are primarily developed in mediums in which are meant and were developed to be infinitely repeatable without cost, right? So to create or introduce artificial scarcity into a space like the digital is quite interesting, because quite early on people were saying, well, this is just about the proof of ownership, without recognizing that that's, you know, like Dan's work is a really great example of that. It's like, well, it's always come down to the work is authentic if you have a COA. The work is not authentic because it's like someone said it's Dan's work. It's authentic because it has a COA with Dan's work. And so NFTs to some extent are like, I've said this before, but it's sort of like the ultimate conceptual art, because it forms and structures the work about ultimately the proof of ownership, which then authenticates the work from just saying, like, having just a straight JPEG or, you know, right click save as is like the ultimate burn of the NFT is actually about, well, you know, so that's the bootleg, but if it's exactly identical to the real or the authentic, like, which is the authentic? And so that's something that I'm constantly thinking about, and I'm very fascinated about, both like physical assets and physical goods, but also digital goods and digital assets.
And do you think it's inherently built within like the NFT that, you know, that it can't kind of petrify into an authentic? I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, maybe some of those, you know, they retrospectively, you kind of look back at kind of Robert Morris and Dan Blab and stuff and say, well, it was always meant to be, you know, shared and distributed. And it was almost like an anti-aesthetic in a way, kind of deliberately kind of built into the kind of ready-made material, like, you know, off the shelf kind of fluorescent tubes and these kind of things. And then, of course, as time went by, then it became much more about like, well, no, this is the original one. This is the one that kind of bears that kind of mark, despite all of its measures being taken to get away from kind of an artistic kind of signature. It became this kind of thing. And is that something that is inherently built in the NFT that resists that tendency towards, you know, the fetishization of an authentic original?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is exactly, I don't even know how to say it better. It is very much about the kind of fetishization or being the first, or this notion of like a genesis drop of an artist who has a pre-existing body of work. I mean, I think what was quite interesting for me is when I did my first NFT, people were really obsessed with this idea of getting the first one, not realizing I had like, you know, prior 12 years of a body of work that they like had zero interest in. So kind of like, what is the notion in a person's mind, or how do you define what is the first or what is an original? And even to some extent, like that goes across the conversation around contemporary work. It's like, well, this notion that anyone owns a color or a shape or a concept, and that things are continually like referencing each other, and artists don't continually reference and work within each other's body of works. You know, like the way I get inspiration is I go to galleries and I see other artists' work. It's not like existing in this whole. So it all comes back sort of, I guess, to that idea and this obsession, especially in Western culture, of like dominating and being the first, and ownership and like the right to own, and sort of having this right of accessibility, or, you know, cultural capitalism. I think is very prevalent in NFTs to some extent.
It's built on scarcity, of course, as well, isn't it? So
yeah,
it's like you completely then, you know, taking that out of the, I mean, it's hilarious to think that people would be like, oh, I want the first of the NFTs. But it seems getting out of that kind of mode of thinking, or at least it's a challenge to that kind of mode of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Or like just challenging the awareness of that mode of thinking, or why that's important. You know, I think that's something that people still need to do.
I also want to go back a bit and ask you about, you know, you're a founding member of the cyber feminist collective, Deep Lab. Can you tell us a little bit about the collective, its projects, and particularly what potentials are being generated through the collaboration of women working with new media technologies? What particularly does that bring to the table? That's not an odd way to put it.
Yeah. So Deep Lab, we actually disbanded about a year and a half ago, and that was just a decision that we felt that it had kind of lived its lifespan. But it was created under a Warhol Foundation grant, under the context of creating work about surveillance and about hacker culture. And at that time, I had worked in a lot of collaboratives, but they were always heavily male dominated, to the point that it would be often like 20 to 25 guys and myself. And I thought, there's so many interesting women in this space that aren't being necessarily getting the visualization, or being represented, or having any sort of chance to, you know, have a foot at the table. I was like, what would it look like to create that table and bring them in, and like give them visibility and give them money, and like give them space to do all these things that they're not getting because they're not, you know, the ones who are always on the speaker's podium. And so that was sort of the precipice of why it was created. And that was sort of the lifespan that it lived, was like about getting work and conversations going within public spaces in which women were at the forefront of those conversations, versus just sort of in the background.
And I actually have a question here that came as well from someone, which is, there's a perception of the internet as a male space.
Yes.
What do you imagine a more female internet might look like?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think of it as a more of a neutral space, but I think of certain spaces to be more male dominated. So I think, for example, like chat roulette is a really good example of a male dominated space, or crypto to some extent, like until recently it was like a pretty male dominated space. And I think a lot of that has to do with the obfuscation of onboarding and not having easy ways to understand or utilize or make it accessible. And then it's always about like who ultimately owns the keys to the money, who owns the keys to the power, who owns the keys to the fluency or the technical fluency to be able to do that. And if they're not willing to share that or make it accessible to others, it remains like a closed, gated community. So part of why the internet is possibly male dominated is because it's been created for men, by men, for men to use. And I think crypto, unfortunately, is no exception to that. And it's only been in the last year or two that women have really started to proliferate that space and start thinking about, how do you shape this and make it accessible? And how do you bring other women in? And how do you bring people of color in and people outside of the West? So it's not just about, the West gaining all of this wealth and further wealth discrepancies. It's about bringing in people and making it accessible to them outside of just ourselves. And so I've seen a lot of people starting to bring and widen that conversation outside of making it accessible to people in Africa or Uganda or Rwanda or South America, and sort of having these conversations about, this is how you do it, these are your options, like this is how you get in for this amount of money, like what is it that you're trying to do, like looking at it from sort of the value proposition of an individual level versus like assuming that everyone is just this white dude that lives in Berlin and he's making $500,000 a year and sleeps on the floor. Like, I think there needs to be, in order for it to become a more female or more inclusive or whatever like word we're going to put in front of web, we need to have those people actually part of that conversation and not excluded from it.
I mean, is it, I'm just thinking myself here, but like, is it also kind of like a regressive kind of like gatekeeping that's kind of built in there? And just the example I'm kind of thinking of here is like gaming, that everybody's playing games. Like my mom plays games, my friends, like women I know, I play game stuff, and yet somehow there's still a community has been built up based on like archaic ideas of what serious gaming is, which is generally like people shooting each other or sports or these kind of things, without allowing for different kind of forms of that as well. I mean, that's just an example kind of putting out there, but is it also a case of going, well, look, we have a new medium here, we have a new space, why replicate older structures that have actually been very exclusionary all the way through?
Because I think people in power don't necessarily want to give up power. So the reason why we're seeing a replication of Web 2 into Web 3 is that the same people that had the money and the power in Web 2 are just transferring it to Web 3. So in order to have like a true kind of transfer of power or wealth or whatever like the metric is that we're going to look at, we have to have those people willing to either give up some of that or make it accessible to other people. And in the end, I think one of the things I realized is so many people are in it for themselves and only for themselves. So you have to really find people who are like, yeah, I'm willing to open that door for you. I'm willing to risk my power and my privilege to make yours possible. And I think that that's unfortunately like a hard thing to find. So it's about finding the people that are willing to do that and like elevating their positions within the community so that they can elevate others.
I have a very audience question here, which is a quite specific hypothetical one, but because you've been talking about themes of authenticity, and how would you feel about selling your artworks to, say, Mark Zuckerberg for a gallery in his metaverse in terms of ownership, exhibition, and ethics? I mean, do you see potential in the space, like the idea of the metaverse, or is it just actually a new model of the same old kind of hierarchies and structures?
I'm still making up my mind. I think that the space is so young that it's really hard to draw a conclusion about it right now. And I think what I've currently seen is that it's not super usable because the technology, and when I say technology, I mean like hardware specifically, just isn't there. Like in terms of GPU power at a normal level for the normal person, it's not there that people can actually experience it in a way that's pleasurable or fun or enjoyable. To some extent, like there are some exceptions to that, but they aren't truly by definition like a metaverse. There's something else. And it's also again, like I'm not sure that's where I want the world to go. It's like you put your energy into what you want to see and where you want the world to be headed. But I don't really want it to be a space in which if I'm going to interact with my friends or see people, it's like in front of a computer. I want to actually be out in the world. And that's something I've been really trying to push to my own kids or my family, is like, let's get out in the world and not like experience it through a screen. We have so many opportunities to be on a screen. Why should we create one more? I do think there's some interesting kind of angles in metaverses in terms of accessibility, or creating spaces or places in which people can't normally, for whatever reason, be it financial or economical or geographical, cannot get to. I think that there are some educational opportunities there and some possible opportunities for innovation, but I'm not sure necessarily what that looks like given the current sort of restrictions around APIs and SDKs and sort of the accessibility of those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's has potential, but I guess it's somebody else's potential. So it's kind of, being set up for you. It reminds me of something. Many years ago, I went to see Richard Stallman give a talk. And I remember him talking about that shift away from learning to code or program, and the way that companies like Apple facilitated this tendency, giving computers to schools so that children could learn how to use their devices, of course, but they could also become dependent on them. They wouldn't be able to question or submit their property. They wouldn't be able to tinker with the devices. And I know there's still artists and activists who very much work against the ownership of intellectual property. This fixed model. But is it also just a case here, and I think here of the shift from net art to so-called post-internet art, that becomes about kind of an ease, about working within set confines, but still really being unable to affect or alter the underlying structure?
I mean, it's definitely in the interest of them to create consumers that are read-only. And when I mean that, I mean they're not able to change or appropriate or use the technology in a way that doesn't break the TOCs of that hardware. And I think that to some extent, humans were just naturally drawn towards convenience, myself included. It's like I have an iPhone because it is convenient. I don't have the Linux open source one that I have to weld myself, because I don't have that interest in putting my time towards that. Is about putting my time into something else. So it's picking your battles. It's kind of similar to paper straws. I think a lot people are they want to save the environment, but they don't want to do it in a way that they have to put energy towards it. So it's what's the most convenient way to do that? And it's okay, paper straws. Everyone gets paper straws, and that's how we save the environment. So it's about these micro steps and not thinking about maybe the larger sort of I have to save the world and I have 30 days. It's about thinking about, well, what are the small kind of tangible things I can do? And maybe that's about, not turning Siri on, or not having an Amazon whatever in your phone, or maybe don't have a smartwatch. Just thinking about these small things you can do as sort of gestures against that surveillance, I think is really powerful.
I mean, of course, I think we're both aware of the irony of us doing this through Zoom as well.
Exactly. I mean, we're not using Jitsi Talk for a reason, right? So it's always about kind of what is the default in terms of stability, convenience. When we're in the context of, okay, we can't travel, or it's hard to be traveling, what is the context in which we can connect? And it's not going to be necessarily through a cryptographically secure email. It's going to be through a WhatsApp text. It's going to be through Zoom, because it's just ultimately that's what it comes down to, is what is convenient in terms of making the lowest point of resistance from A to B. It's not about creating these complicated scenarios for ourselves. And I think really, in a sense, companies leech and take advantage of that, because they know that people won't necessarily go out of their way and make things more difficult just for this small difference in how they're communicating.
But this is it. I mean, it's what, that's your network effects right there, isn't it? It's about kind of ease and just having something off the shelf that you don't have to actually, we don't have to build our own telepresence kind of set up here for a talk.
Right.
I've just got a little bit of time here left. I did want to ask you about a couple of recent projects of yours. And these are, Believe Me, this is the work that was commissioned by the Whitney Museum of American Art online project. That you talk about is also as a reflection on Donald Trump, and particularly this term, believe me, is his most often used phrase, which sounds right. And then also, of course, your American flag wonderful exhibition at Bitform's Gallery in 2021, where you used red and blue ink dripping from IV bags to create an abstract image of the Stars and Stripes. I wonder, what role do you see art as in offering I guess, a model or a stance against right-wing politics, and can it be an effective counter to particularly things like nationalism? And I'm just trying to force kind of an equation here between this kind of anti-nationalism and maybe new media art or digital art is something that, at least in its techno-utopian ideals, is inherently globalized. I know globalization is also a bad word these days, but I guess if you have to pick one or the other, right?
Right. I tried really hard when I made that piece to not make it about politics beyond the title, because I wanted it to be very much about the experience of growing up in America in like the 80s and 90s, when American exceptionalism was like at its peak, at least from my perception and my point of view, like living on the West Coast, was that everything was great. America's, amazing. Like everyone gets along. We all love each other. Like this sort of idealized notion of what America was in like the most white picket fence, like perfect, way. And then having that sort of all crumble, and having it crumble through sort of a decentralized way. And when I say that, I mean like through screens and through devices and through spaces in which we experience things from not just like a more personal level, but like for most of us, like a very global scale. And sort of this disintegration, I think for me, especially growing up and then, getting outside of the States and realizing, oh, like most countries hate us. And actually most countries like think we're stupid, and most countries think that we're wasteful, and all these things that like I believed or grew up to believe, that we were like the pinnacle of what everyone wanted to be, instead of realizing that actually like that was a completely misguided narrative. And sort of coming to terms with that, I think living abroad for the last 12 or 13 years, sort of realizing, like humbleizing myself from the perspective of, okay, actually like Americans are usually the ones that people don't want in the room. And we are like naive, and we are unaware, and we don't necessarily, acknowledge our access to wealth and our access to privilege, and our access to, how much we consume and how much we use. And just like realizing that this whole like narrative that I grew up believing, that we were this, good thing, was like broken and cracked. And like, how do you come to terms with that? While at the same time, like having a change of political regime in the US, in which we went from everyone kind of feeling like we were together to like this very fractured society in a very fast way. And then realizing, as I talked to a lot of my friends, like that was always the case for them. It was just that I positioning being in the position of like a white straight woman, never felt that or recognized it, and just never, I think, coming to terms with the fact that it was like, oh, I never like took the time to realize that this was so much of a problem for everyone else outside of my identity or my sphere, because I never took the time to ask them. I just assumed we were all having the same experience, and sort of this like light bulb moment of that disappointment in myself, but like the disappointment in the country, and then like extrapolating that into a piece of work where it became about convenience, because people tend to break their screens and they don't fix them, especially my friends in the States for some reason. So they would all have broken screens, and they would be like, oh, my phone's been broken for, the last year. I just haven't had time to fix it. And realizing like everything that we're viewing is through this cracked glass, and how there's something very like poetic about that brokenness, because it is a reflection of, I think, everything else that we not only like internalize as who we are, but also like how we're seen outside of ourselves, both like personally and as a nation.
I literally dropped my phone like about 5 minutes ago as well. I was talking to you as well. It feels very apropos for the conversation, but it's intriguing to me that again, and I don't want to get into the whole Silicon Valley kind of utopianism of like the kumbaya kind of thing, but it actually ends up being, it becomes this kind of easy networked model of actually xenophobia and
Right.
and conspiracy, and it's fascinating to me that has now become the dominant narrative around the internet in a way that it never used to be. I used to be the bit of the Wild West, I kind of remember, and
exactly.
and it's like, well, this is what happens in the Wild West, I guess. I have one last question here from one of our viewers, which is, I would love to know what you both think. There we go. About the physical exhibition showcasing digital copies of old paintings, such as the current Unit London exhibition of 6 treasured Italian masterpieces. I guess this could also extend to things like the immersive the immersive Van Gogh, no, the immersive Van Gogh
I
experience,
think it
these
was
kind of things.
Picasso. Yeah, I didn't see
Yeah.
this, but I
I
heard
haven't
about
seen
it.
these either. But the idea of showcasing digital copies of, the great masters, whether that's an immersive environment or through a screen, it's an interesting one, I think. But I'll let you go first.
I'm not actually sure I have an answer to that. Like, I don't even know if I have an opinion because I haven't experienced it. So my assumption is like the tactility is very different and therefore the experience is different, but I haven't been in those exhibitions yet to actually have a formed opinion. That's my anticlimactic
I also
climate.
really haven't.
That's the end of my artist talk. That's all I have to say. There's nothing else I can add. Sorry.
I also don't really know either because I haven't seen it, and partly that's the fact that I don't know if I've searched them out, because on some level, no matter how much you kind of say it, the authenticity of the original, the aura is
exactly.
It's very hard to resist. It's hard to kind of get away from. So yeah, I think that would also be my kind of take on it as well. I think we're pretty much out of time, Addie, but I really appreciate you joining us today. And I know you've been kind of caught in crazy weather. We have crazy weather here as well at the moment. So we had a bit of snow as well, but greatly appreciate it. And as always, a pleasure to talk to you. And
yeah, likewise, I really appreciate it. And thank you for all your questions and insights. It's always a joy. So.
And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, Addie's work, All I Know and Then Some, will be on view here at the Glucksman as part of the exhibition Data Streams until the 13th of March. And we're back next Wednesday at 1 p.m. For the next talk in our series with artist Clemens von Wedemeyer. So you're all welcome to attend that as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for attending. And once again, thank you very much to Addie Wagenknecht.